Today, walk into a Chinese restaurant and you see flames roaring under the wok and a huge wok being tossed over the flame. Most people assume Chinese people have always cooked this way, but that is a huge misconception. For much of China's long history, stir-frying wasn't even the dominant way to cook. For many ordinary people, it was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Chinese cooks had known how to stir-fry for centuries, so why did it take so long to become everyday cooking in ordinary homes? Today, that's the story we are going to tell. Go back to the 6th century. An ancient Chinese book about farming and everyday life already recorded a method of stir-frying. Crack eggs into a copper pan, add the seasonings and the sesame oil, then cook them quickly over the heat. The author even added one comment: it smelled and tasted wonderful. Right next to it, the book also described cracking eggs directly into boiling water. And that wasn't all. The same book also included steaming and roasting. In other words, stir-frying was only one way of cooking. It wasn't the star of the kitchen. Because long before stir-frying appeared, people in China had already been steaming and boiling food for thousands of years. In 1977, archaeologists excavated the Peligang site in Henan. At this settlement dating back roughly 8,000 years, they found the pottery vessels used for steaming and boiling. Move forward to the Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago. The Mawangdui tombs in Changsha were excavated, and once again, the tombs contained steamers, cooking pots, and clay jars. By the Yuan Dynasty, 7 or 8 centuries had passed since that stir-fried egg recipe. People were still steaming chicken, boiling meat in deep pots, and simmering soups. By the Qing Dynasty, stir-fried dishes had become far more varied, but steaming, boiling, and slow braising was still firmly rooted in the Chinese kitchen. So here's the real question. With thousands of years of established cooking habits already in place, what did stir-frying have to go through before it became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Chinese kitchen today? To understand how stir-frying pulled off this comeback, first look at what you need to stir-fry a dish today. Walk into a modern kitchen and you got a strong blue flame roaring under the stove. Cooking oil is always within reach, and sitting over the flame is a metal pan that heats up fast. But go back to an earlier kitchen, and none of those things was so easy to come by. The first thing holding stir-frying back was oil. In early Chinese kitchens, most cooking fat still came from animals, which meant the supply of fat was closely tied to how many animals people raised and slaughtered. From the Han through the Tang periods, oil crops such as sesame and rapeseed came into wider use. More sources of vegetable oil began to appear. But early oil extraction was extremely crude. Seeds were crushed in stone mortars, then pressed using simple leverage. It took enormous physical effort for very little oil. By the Song Dynasty, oil processing techniques and equipment had become far more developed. The Northern Song government even operated specialized oil workshops where dozens of workers produced oil at once. They even purchased sesame in bulk. Oil sellers also appeared on city streets, carrying their goods on shoulder poles. Oil was becoming easier to get. But for many ordinary families, oil was still a luxury to be used sparingly. Still, the first thing stir-frying needed was finally becoming easier to obtain. But oil alone wasn't enough. You also needed the right pan. night falls, restaurants in Kaifeng, the capital of the Song dynasty, are glowing with light. In the kitchen, a cook grips a large ladle, throws chopped ingredients into an iron pan, and quickly stir-fries them. Today, that scene looks completely ordinary. But China had waited more than 1,000 years for an iron pan like this. In 1956, archaeologists in Shan County, Henan, unearthed a set of cooking vessels from the Western Han Dynasty. The lower vessel was used for boiling. The upper one was a steamer. Functionally, it still belonged to China's much older system of boiling and steaming. By the Sui and Tang dynasties, a new kind of iron pan had appeared, shallow, flat-bottomed, and fitted with a handle. Compared with the deep pots used for boiling, this pan was much better suited to cooking methods that needed direct contact with a hot surface like pan frying and griddle cooking. A few centuries later, the iron pan went through an even bigger transformation. By the Northern Song, major cities such as Kaifeng were growing rapidly. Construction, heating, and iron production were consuming enormous amounts of wood. Firewood became increasingly scarce in the north. Even the imperial government had to bring it in from elsewhere. So coal began entering urban life and industrial production on a scale never seen before. In some iron-producing regions, coal and coke began replacing part of the charcoal supply. At the same time, water-powered bellows and iron smelting furnaces kept improving. Together, these changes helped Song-era iron production expand rapidly. Then, in 2007, a Southern Song merchant ship that had been on the water for more than 800 years was raised from the sea. Along with its cargo of ceramics, archaeologists found something else: large numbers of iron cooking pans, stacked together and tied in bundles. That cargo showed something important. By the Southern Song, iron pans could already be produced in bulk, shipped in bulk, and even exported overseas as a major commodity. Oil supplies were expanding. Iron pans were entering the market in larger numbers. At this point, you might think stir-frying was finally ready to enter every household. But that is not what happened. By the early 12th century, the Song capital had become a megacity of more than 1 million people. Restaurants and food shops were everywhere. One book, Recalling Life, in the Northern Song capital, described what happened inside these restaurants. Customers walked in and ordered different dishes. The kitchen had to serve them on demand. A server might come rushing out, carrying nearly 20 different bowls at once, and not a single one could go to the wrong table. In a kitchen moving this fast, stir-frying had one increasingly obvious advantage. You could put a dish on the heat only after it was ordered and finish it quickly. With that kind of speed, made-to-order stir-fried dishes began appearing in greater and greater numbers. Later records already list dishes like stir-fried rabbit, stir-fried pork lung, and stir-fried crab. By the Ming Dynasty, cooks were squeezing something else out of all that speed. Now, speed itself could determine texture. Take organ meats, where timing matters enormously. A Ming-era guide to everyday living recorded one famous dish: stir-fried lamb tripe. Slice the tripe into thin strips, blanch it quickly in hot water, drain it, throw it into the pan, stir-fry fast, then get it out immediately. The book even warned, wait just a little too long, and the tripe turns chewy, like a rubber band. The same book gives almost the same instructions for stir-fried kidney. By this point, stir-frying wasn't just fast. It could create tenderness and crunch that steaming and boiling had a hard time reproducing. Restaurants wanted speed, cooks wanted texture, and stir-frying became increasingly important in commercial kitchens. But before stir-frying could become something ordinary families used every day, you would have to wait several more centuries. As early as the 13th century, a book on household cooking was already describing high-heat stir-frying. By the 16th century, another text listed more than 40 dishes cooked by stir-frying in oil. So it looks like stir-frying had already made it into the home. But in that very same century, some poor mountain communities in Zhejiang could barely afford cooking oil at all. Some people even used the starchy liquid left over from cooking rice to stir-fry vegetables. They called it rice oil, and that exposed the first real barrier to stir-frying: oil. But oil wasn't the whole problem. Even if you had a little oil, you still needed something to put in the pan. Meat, eggs, tofu, vegetables. Today, none of that sounds unusual. But for poor families in the past, the first priority was simply getting enough food to fill everyone's stomach. In 1930, researchers surveyed 11 villages in Qingyuan, Hebei. They found that ordinary farming households spent 90% of their food budget on staple grains. Meat took just 3%, vegetables 2%, seasonings 5%. Decades later, researchers returned and interviewed elderly villagers. Looking back on those years, they remembered it this way: ordinary families in the village simply didn't eat stir-fried dishes. Even by the middle of the 20th century, cooking oil was scarce enough to be rationed. To buy it, you needed oil ration coupons. During the hardest years, in some places, a person received only 100 or 200 grams of cooking oil a month, sometimes even less. So when some families wanted to stir-fry something, they heated the iron pan, then rubbed a piece of pork skin with a little fat still attached across the bottom. As soon as the pan showed the faintest sheen of grease, the vegetables went in. When most of a family's food budget had to go toward staple grains, spending extra money on oil, meat, or vegetables just to stir-fry a dish could be a luxury they simply could not afford. So, for centuries, the real challenge in China was never learning how to stir-fry. It was finding enough oil for the pan and enough ingredients to make a dish. What finally changed this was the second half of the 20th century. Agricultural output rose. More oilseed crops were planted, and the production and distribution of cooking oil expanded. At the same time, meat, eggs, and vegetables became increasingly available. By the 1980s, many parts of China began gradually lifting controls on grain and cooking oil supplies. By the early 1990s, grain and oil ration coupons were finally disappearing from everyday life across the country. Before stir-frying had fully entered ordinary Chinese homes, it had already left China. In the mid-19th century, the gold rush and the railroad construction brought large numbers of Chinese immigrants to the United States. They brought rice, they brought chopsticks, and they brought the cooking pans and techniques they knew from home. Today, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History still holds a wok and a spatula used by Chinese immigrants in the 1880s. But when the gold rush faded and the railroads were finished, finding work became increasingly difficult for Chinese immigrants. So some of them turned to the restaurant business. Then, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act severely restricted the entry of Chinese laborers, while discrimination in the job market grew even worse. Under those conditions, restaurants became a way for more Chinese immigrants to make a living. And just as Chinese food was beginning to win over American diners, one dish quickly became almost synonymous with Chinese food in America. It was chop suey. It wasn't one fixed, unchanging recipe. Restaurants could use whatever ingredients were easy to get locally. And this logic of swapping ingredients and recombining them was exactly what stir-frying was good at. But Chinese restaurants never served only stir-fried food. So why is it that when people picture a Chinese kitchen, the wok and stir-frying are still the first things that come to mind? Because with steaming, once the lid goes on, there isn't much to see. Stewing, you find it all over the world. But stir-frying is different. The cooking itself is a spectacle. But for a cooking technique to truly cross cultures, being seen isn't enough. It also needs a name of its own. In 1945, 补为央俏 published a Chinese cookbook written specifically for English-speaking readers, how to cook and eat in Chinese. When the book tried to explain the Chinese cooking technique Chao, it ran into a problem. English didn't really have a single word that captured the technique accurately. It wasn't simply fry, it wasn't deep fry, and it certainly wasn't boil or stew. So the book broke the technique down into its basic parts. High heat, a small amount of oil, ingredients cut into small pieces, constant movement, fast cooking. Finally, they gave this whole technique a new English name, stir-fry. From that point on, the English-speaking world finally had a precise word for this technique from the Chinese kitchen. Now it could be written into cookbooks. It could be taught, and people around the world could reproduce it in their own kitchens. From a supporting player in the kitchen to one of the most recognizable sites in Chinese cooking, stir-frying took more than 1,000 years. And more than 1,000 years of change was eventually compressed into a single English word, stir-frying.